Thanks for the public service announcement, Darren. So thanks very much everyone for coming. My name is Graham Harrington, member of the CPI. So just to introduce this event today, I think definitely we'll have to mention the day that's in it. It's 12th of May, the anniversary of James Connolly's murder by British imperialism. So it's worth reflecting on the topic we're discussing. Was also a subject very close to Connolly's heart, given his involvement in the Irish Neutrality League. So I think it is very good that we are upholding and keeping with Connolly's legacy. So we'll get straight into it. Our first speaker will be Patricia McKenna. Patricia was a former member of the European Parliament from 1994 until 2004. So Patricia, if you would like to start this way there. So.
Okay, right. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me here to speak on neutrality. I'm kind of in two minds about whether I even want to speak on neutrality at all, because it just, like, what has been happening over the last 30 or something years, like when I was elected to the European Parliament in 1994 to 2004. Before that, in the late 80s and early 90s, we were actively campaigning on neutrality, trying to get neutrality enshrined in the Constitution, but also very, very active on the issue of neutrality. And Fianna Fáil and the other part. Now, by the way, at that stage I was in the Greens. Sorry. And the Greens have actually done a complete U-turn, not just in Ireland, but right across the board in relation to their position on neutrality and on peace and on disarmament and on their now support for war. The German Green leader, Petra Kelly, who was a pacifist and campaigned for peace and was here in this country, we launched a campaign in Boswell's one day, but back in, I think it was 89, some positive neutrality for Ireland. She was our first signature. She was really into it. If you look at what the German Greens are doing now, they're actually supporting the war in Ukraine, they're supporting war in general, they're supporting the idea of arming people to the teeth, they're supporting the idea of using our taxpayers' money to produce and export and sell and provide arms to kill human beings. It just beggars belief. The Greens in this country, when we could see the writing on the wall, I could see it for a long, long time before I left, that what was happening. The Greens did a complete U-turn on the position on neutrality. Now, and on that, I suppose, I'm not going to say too much on it, because I'd talk all night on what the Greens have betrayed us on, but that'd be a bit of a waste of time. One of the issues that did come up during the various different referenda on the EU treaties was, of course, always the issue of neutrality, from the Single European Act when I got involved first, right up to the Lisbon Treaty and beyond. This key issue was neutrality and the further militarisation of Europe. And I did a booklet one time about, I think it was on the Nice Treaty, about the way to a centralised, undemocratic military superstate, and that's what we have within the European Union now. We have the European Union is no longer this common market, it's basically a European empire armed to the teeth and taking away any shred of neutrality for any member states that still have a little bit. And it's not as if they're taking it from Ireland as if we don't want to give it. Micheál Martin has basically sold us out completely. I suppose he's looking for his next little position, which probably will be out in Europe. And you look at all the Irish politicians that have got their little perky jobs in Europe, they have completely turned their back on what is traditionally something that the Irish people support, that's peace, the international peaceful resolution of disputes, neutrality, and non-support for military intervention as a solution to global conflicts. The triple lock was one of the issues that came in. Now that's what they're talking about at the moment, and I'm only just going to talk on this because my ears perked up there some weeks back when I heard about this so-called National Consultative Forum, in relation to the whole issue of Ireland's position in Europe and in the world. Basically, let's see how we get rid of neutrality. They know that there's widespread support out there for neutrality, so they come up with this National Consultative Forum. And in that, they're going to get rid of the triple lock. But having said that, I never had any confidence or faith in the triple lock. The triple lock, basically, what it meant was that we couldn't get involved in military conflicts unless we had the agreement of the Oireachtas, the Dáil, and that it had, the only key thing was that it had a United Nations mandate. But as regards our politicians, I wouldn't trust any of them to the back door. I mean, the politicians in the Dáil, of course, some people accept it. But really what they've done is they've sold us out, and I'm sorry, I don't know if there's any Sinn Féin people here, but I don't trust Sinn Féin either on neutrality. I mean, I don't see how you can support arming Ukraine to the teeth and then turn around and say you're in favour of neutrality. So if I'm insulting people here, sorry, but that's it. The writing is on the wall, and I can see it with Sinn Féin, the same as I can see it with the Green Party. You cannot trust them in relation to thinking that they're going to support us long term. The same as Fianna Fáil would claim to be in favour of neutrality, while at the same time selling us down the Liffey in relation to neutrality and our international tradition on neutrality. Now, I just want to, and I'm only going to talk on this, and I saw the thing on the National Consultative Forum. I says, what's going on here? What they're doing is basically they're setting up a system whereby they're going to manipulate everything to get the result they want. And before I just go to that, I think you have to put things into context. Over the last number of years, and I suppose it became really obvious during the COVID pandemic and the lockdown and all of the emergency legislation that was brought in, a huge amount of people were, I suppose, reluctant to speak out because they didn't want to be considered as some sort of COVID deniers or people who were basically with the Gem O'Dohertys of this world. But there was a lot that went on and a huge amount of control by the media and control by the politicians in relation to what kind of positions and views people held, to the extent that a lot of people have been more or less suppressed into silence. And it's just an example of it. The same has happened very recently in relation to what's happening with the legislation on hate speech. They're very clever in the way they manipulate this. They take out, they use an example, for example, racist hate speech, because they know that the vast majority of us would not tolerate it. We don't tolerate racism, and we don't tolerate targeting any nationality for any reason whatsoever. So they pick on that. And that's what they're using. Whereas in actual fact, what they're going to do is introduce legislation that could be far and wide in relation to suppressing people's right to freedom of speech and to freedom to express themselves. And in that context, I'm just going to talk about what's happening now in relation to this National Consultative Forum. And if you have to go any further and talk about how you pigeonhole people or you characterize people as being certain things. I mean, Mick, Wallace and Claire Daly in the European Parliament, the media has gone to great lengths to demonise them, to try and present them as something that they're not, simply because they don't like what they're saying and they're not towing the line. As when I was in the Greens, Stephen Collins from the Irish Times said the wonder when the Greens were ever going to get rid of that stinging nettle. You know, they don't like you if you don't shut up and you don't conform and you don't keep quiet when there is something that they want pushed through and there's people objecting to it. And that's what we have to do. And I think on the neutrality issues, what's coming up now, the National Consultative Forum. So when I saw this, I sent a few questions to Thomas Pringle to ask would he ask some Dáil questions, because he couldn't find out anything about it. I emailed him first and said, what's going on with this? He says, I'm in the same position as you. He says, first I heard of it was in the media. So that's the kind of consultation you have within the Dáil with the democratically elected members of the Dáil in relation to this. So we did ask a few questions and there was something came back on it in relation. I have the reply here, but I just, where is it? What they're talking about is it's a major Irish. The forum is going to be. It's convened. It will with a view to initiating an open, evidence-based discussion on the state's foreign and security policy. Now, an open, evidence-based discussion. What does that actually mean? It means it will be an open debate based on the evidence that they're going to provide and not open evidence as in relation to evidence that comes from all different quarters. The next thing is they say the Consultative Forum is designed to build public understanding and generate discussion. Now just take the public understanding. What do they mean by public understanding? What they mean there is that they have to make the public understand or to basically the propaganda they will use will try and convince the people that what they're doing is not really what they're doing, but it's something else. So it's public understanding. In fact, it's public misunderstanding. It's trying to deceive the public in relation to what they're going to do. And then they talk about generate discussion on the link between the state's foreign and security policy and defence policy. Now, generate discussion. What does that mean? First of all, if you're going to generate discussion, the only way you can generate discussion is to have people from various different viewpoints having a discussion where everybody's voice will be equally heard and all views will be equally heard. But that is not what's going to happen. It will take place over 3 days, 3 locations around the country. And it will be the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Defence will work alongside the chairperson. Now, I don't know how they picked this chairperson. That was one of the questions they asked Thomas Pringle to ask. But they selected this chairperson anyway, and the chairperson is a Louise Richardson, and she's Dame Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. She's a US citizen, and she was the author of What Terrorists Want, Random House 2007. Now, that book is basically... Well, it says it itself, what terrorism was. In other words, it's a US propaganda book in relation to convincing people that, yeah, there's terrorists out there and we all have to work together to get rid of them, i.e. the people who are terrorists are people who don't support American foreign policy. She is also she was strongly opposed to granting concessions to Republican hunger strike prisoners, suggesting that it would be if this is the kind of person they're putting in charge of this, it's quite clear she's very establishment, she's very pro-America, she is very pro-military, and she's very much completely ignorant of what actual human rights and civil liberties mean if she didn't want to give any concessions to the hunger strikers. She was basically a Thatcherite, or she is a Thatcherite, and that's who they're putting in as the chair, and then the Department of Foreign Affairs will work, and the Department of Defence are going to work alongside her. Don't hold your breath, you know what you're going to get. The Consultative Forum will open with an inclusive, it says, right? Inclusive. I don't know what they mean by inclusive, because it's not inclusive. Attendance at the forum will consist of invited guests from Ireland and internationally. So how is it inclusive when the guests are specifically invited by the powers that be within this country? Now, what happened with the National Forum on Europe some years ago, I mean, what they're doing here is they're manipulating things. They're trying to exclude anyone who has a different viewpoint. And there will be no Mick Wallace's or Claire Daly's or any of the other people who might put in a different word, Karen Devine. No, it will be hand-selected people who will basically present the position the government and the European Union and the international leaders want. And it will then be repackaged, regurgitated back out to the public to say, look, we are moving forward as a nation. We need to support the poor people in wherever it may be Ukraine or anywhere else, and we can't stand idly by and let these things happen. We have a duty, we have a responsibility, and I'm not going to go on any further on that because I think you just need to look at it. But what we need to do is we need to try and get huge public opposition to this. This is a completely manufactured consent exercise by the state to try and present the changes to neutrality and their participation in NATO and every other military thing that they want to get involved in as being with the consent of the people, but it's not with the consent of the people. This is just an exercise of deceit and counterfuge by our government and those that we pay the wages of. And I just want to say that the Swiss on this, the Swiss have taken a very different view to the rest of us in relation to refusing. You know, they have refused to, they've maintained their long-standing policy, and they've refused to allow German deliveries of Swiss manufactured ammunition to go to Ukraine. I mean, just because, and I think that's the right position, you have to take a moral position on this. You can't take anything else. And when you listen to, just recently I decided I might think about, I wonder is it possible to go to Russia these days? So I was looking up for flights. And the flights, of course, any flights from Russia can't go through European airspace, etc. And then I was thinking, like, when is this all going to end? It says they will only lift the restriction on Russian flights in European airspace when Ukraine wins the war. So that's what it's all about. It's about having a winner, i.e. Ukraine. And it's not about saving lives and trying to negotiate a peace and let both sides, give and take a little bit. No, it's not. Lives are expendable so long as the US and NATO get what they want. And that is basically using the Ukraine as a killing field for their proxy war, NATO's proxy war with Russia. That's what it's about. And that's what we're getting involved in. And that's what this so-called National Consultative Forum. It's not a National Consultative Forum. It's a complete and total disregard for democratic process, paid for by us, the taxpayer, to ensure that the government can then put a so-called democratic ribbon around this package and present it to us as something that we have actually supported. I'll finish on that.
Thanks very much for that, Patricia. You certainly didn't hold back, which is what we like to see. So next we'll go to Mick Wallace. Mick is a current member of the European Parliament and a perennial thorn in the side of the establishment, whether it's in Ireland or in Europe. Who knows where he'll go to next. So Mick, would you like to take us on?
Okay, thanks. Well, just to touch on two of the many points that Patricia made. Both myself and Claire Daly, we would have serious reservations about the forum coming up as well. So we decided that we would apply for the opportunity to be allowed to participate and speak on it. So we'll get back to you when we get an answer. So listen, I'll do nothing out. Everything is possible, we'll see. But it'll be interesting, the response. So, on the issue of consent that you just mentioned there at the end, it actually links in with the fact that I don't know how much how sad lives you live and how much you follow the European Parliament, but Claire and myself, in October and January, we put in amendments to the regular resolution on Russia, which we refused to support, not because we support Russia, but none of them called for peace, and we've opposed most of the resolutions. But obviously, because we're calling for peace, rather than supporting Ukraine or the US NATO proxy war, we're accused of being Putin puppets, but we have zero time for Putin, who is not much better than the others. But anyway, in terms of consent, we had an amendment in October and January which said, calling on the EU to maximise the opportunity to initiate diplomacy and dialogue with a view to bringing the war to an end and establishing peace. 80% of the politicians voted against peace. 80% of the politicians voted against peace. We weren't taking sides, we were calling for peace. It was pretty basic. Yet at the same time, the European Council for Foreign Relations, which is an EU body, conducted a very extensive survey last June, right, only 4 months after the war started. And one of the main questions in it was, do you support peace now, or do you think we should continue to punish Russia? And at that time, only 4 months into the war, many months ago, at that stage, over 70% of the 10 countries in the European Union that were surveyed, and it was very extensive in those 10 countries, over 70% said they wanted peace. That figure has since gone over 80%. So we have over 80% of the people wanting peace, we have over 80% of the politicians wanting war. And you can do the maths yourself. Now, look at, I was asked to speak about neutrality and Irish neutrality, and I suppose, first of all, what I've seen in the since the war started, from Irish media and politicians, has been it's kind of scary what's going on, and they're promoting a stupid war, and all wars are stupid, and we're opposed to all war. irrespective of who starts it or for what reason, because war doesn't make any sense. And only working class people die in war. The rich people don't fight. And the people in the media and the politicians that are promoting the war, I think it's a great idea to actually pump arms morning, noon and night into this war. Most of them, in fact, I take back, all of them, they are either too old to conscript or their kids are too rich to be fighting in this war or any war. So we have people in suits recommending a war and promoting a war. It's a fight for democracy against authoritarianism. But actually it isn't. It's a very ridiculous war, and obviously the biggest losers of all are the people of Ukraine, because they reckon at this stage over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have probably perished in this war. I'm not sure about the number of Russians, and Ukraine as a country is being destroyed and will not recover in the next 20 years, no matter how much money they throw at it. So it's mad that the people who actually initiate war and promote it never want to fight in it, because they know that war is stupid, but they have other ambitions. The Irish have always been fond of our neutrality. We never liked the idea of being killed or killing others in wars that have nothing to do with us, because none of the wars have anything to do with us. They're generally of an imperialist nature, and they don't actually concern us. And why in God's name would we attach ourselves to any side? I don't think we should be taking the side of the Russians, and neither do I think we should be taking the side of the Americans and the European states, who are very happy to promote this war to suit their own agenda. But just, I suppose, I wanted to touch on, for me, Irish neutrality today and the threat to it is very much linked to what's happening in the EU. And so I wanted to kind of concentrate a bit on that, and obviously you'll have questions and answers afterwards, and answer anything you like. But for those of you that follow the scene there, one of the more recent developments is the EU Rapid Development Capacity, whereby we will have 5,000 troops minimum ready to go anywhere to deal with a crisis. Now, anywhere happens to be, actually, it doesn't involve anywhere in the European Union, which you would think would be of our concern, rather than something happening elsewhere, somewhere else. Because when you get involved in other countries, that's actually called foreign interference, right? Which they set up a particular new committee in the European Parliament on only 3 years ago, and Claire Daly is actually a member on that. And I don't know whether he's accessed the activities in the European Parliament, but you should tune into some of them, because you'll find them very interesting. But this rapid reaction force that they wanted to build, and this is happening. Ireland has already committed 120 troops to it. Now, that's a bit strange in many ways. The people of Ireland don't really have a say in the matter, but we have a government that are very happy to get involved in as many of these activities as possible. That brings us actually a bit closer every day to NATO involvement. And we are already involved in training missions that are linked to NATO. We are a member of PESCO, which we shouldn't be. We're also we're involved in the battle groups, but these now are being replaced by this rapid development force, or deployment force, right? Now, this is actually, their basis for rationalising doing this is linked to Article 44 of the European Treaty, right? But that actually says that it talks about the need to react in defence of values and interests. Now, if you sit in the European Parliament, every time you hear the word European values, you kind of feel like getting sick, because it's perceived by them as if we're the only ones with values and nobody else has values. We're the only ones with truth, and any country or culture or ethnicity who has a different approach, well, they're not really values. We have the European values. Well, as myself and Daly have put to one many times, are these the same values that allow you to be completely complicit in the US 100% support, and sadly, and the EU's today, for the Israeli persecution of Palestinians every day? Is it the same values that allows you to support the war in Yemen, where according to the UN figures, over 400,000 are dead and 16 million are starving, and we couldn't give a damn about them because they're the wrong religion and they're the wrong colour? Are these our values? We supported a war in Iraq that had led to the death of over 1 million citizens who were innocent and unarmed. The war in Ukraine is terrible, and Russia were completely wrong to invade. But the idea that this is the first war that ever happened is an incredible lie perpetrated by the politicians and the media. Now, just looking at the breaking down the EU involvement, I like to break it into 5 sections at the moment. First of all, there's the need to bring the desire and the ambition to develop a EU army. Now, 20 years ago, NATO were actually opposing this. Now, NATO is an unusual institution. It was formed in 1949 by the Americans to engage with the European states. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it was about the North Atlantic, and it was really a way of the Americans keeping the Europeans in check to make sure that they didn't go off start doing crazy stuff without their permission, and that they would be subservient to the American project, because the Americans were dominant once they dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Japan when the war was already over, and the Japanese had been trying to surrender the week before, but the Americans weren't really very concerned about how many they killed with the bombs, in order to see that it was going to make them kingpin going forward from there. But this EU army is back on track again, and you have people like von der Leyen very, very pushy on it. She actually doesn't use the term anymore, but everything else. And unfortunately, she would have the support of the same 80% of the politicians, maybe a little more, on the need for an EU army. We started out as an economic union, but we're slowly being turned into a military union. And for what good reason, they haven't given us. But it's not obviously what the people want. The second point, there's a lot of joint EU missions. Now, EU missions, and they tend to be mostly in Africa, because Africa happens to have the most resources at the moment. It's still colonized, and colonialism hasn't really gone away. It's just changed its name, and we're still doing terrible things down there. And we have a very poor approach, right? Because we're actually losing out big time to the Chinese. The Chinese have wiped our eye in Africa. The Chinese haven't brought a gun to Africa. Now, I've no doubt whatever the Chinese are exploiting the place as well. They want the resources of it, and they're getting them. They're getting more resources out of Africa today than anybody. But they haven't brought a gun to the place yet. They're building infrastructure. They're building rail lines. They're building housing. They're building schools and hospitals. Now, they're doing it in their own interest. It's not that they care necessarily about the people, but they have a different approach to the Europeans and Americans. We've been to guns first. The Sahel is a horror scene. It's sub-Saharan Africa, and what's gone on there since 2013 in particular, has been horrific. We've had 20,000 European troops in the Sahel since 2013. 20,000. And what are they doing? that things have got worse. After the NATO destruction of Libya and bombed it back to the Stone Age, made it a failed state where now there's a slave trade operating, a lot of the fighters from there moved further south in pursuit of other work, and they have been very active in the Sahel region. And the Europeans are down there for only one reason, and that is to access cheap minerals. The French had 5,000 troops of their own. The other 15,000 came under a UN mandate, which sadly the UN are playing ball with the colonial project, and the other 15,000 came from different countries in Europe. But the French, 75% of French electricity is produced from nuclear, and France gets 50% of all their uranium from the Sahel region, mostly Niger. So that's what it's all about in the Sahel region. But the place has dilapidated to a terrible degree, and there's huge problems there, and there's huge poverty, there's huge corruption because of the involvement of the EU. Last November, I went to Mozambique to see for myself an EU mission in operation. And you want to say, Mozambique, for those of you that are not great on African geography, right? Mozambique, which is South Africa. Now you wonder, what are EU troops doing down in South Mozambique? Well, we have two missions in Mozambique, which I went down to see. And what they're doing there is, what happened was that about 3 years ago, in Cabo Delgado, which is the northern province of Mozambique, and it's really the only predominantly Muslim part of Mozambique. Mozambique was colonised by the Portuguese, and huge Portuguese involvement still in a lot of the country. But Cabo Delgado, it was discovered one of the largest gas fields discovered for a long time. There was some in the water off the coast, and there was more on land. So the Mozambique government, who are not an impressive crew, decided that they would open prospects to some European companies. So Total Energies, French Total from France, and Eni from Italy were invited down to explore the possibility of excavating for gas. Now, all the environmental advice has been, under no circumstances, start new fields. The environmental crisis is the biggest challenge facing the whole world today, not the Ukraine war. And the idea of opening new gas fields today is unthinkable. But this was happening. Total Energies moved in and explored the place, and Eni, and Total Energies agreed that they would start excavation on land because it's cheaper than water, than in the ocean. So they hired mercenaries to clear 2,000 farmers off the land, get rid of them because they were in the way, in order to start development. And the farmers weren't very impressed. They were mostly of Muslim background, and they started to fight back against the mercenary soldiers. So what we had was a little war started in Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. And then what we had was more resources coming in from the government and some outside forces, and then the Muslims got some support from Islamic fighters in neighbouring countries, and before long it became a bigger war. So EU were coming to the rescue, and they were going to train young soldiers from Mozambique, and I didn't make a film of it, but I found it depressing. We were training these young lads to fight. We were going to make new soldiers because there wasn't enough of them, to fight the jihadists, as they were called then, in northern Mozambique, so that we can clear the land to make it safe for European investment. That's one of our missions in Africa. Our missions in Africa are all about accessing resources, and it's also about stemming migration flows. They don't like the idea that the Africans who want to leave Africa to make a better living in Europe, because their communities and their countries have been destroyed by our exploitation, and so we spend a lot of money as well on dealing with that. Third point I wanted to make was about building a common EU defence, right? Now, in 1960, when he was just as he was on his way out the door and Kennedy was coming in, Eisenhower warned America about what he saw as a very negative development in America. And he says, this refers to something, and no one had ever used the term before. He called it the military-industrial complex. Now he says, what that term means is, he says, we, the state, we give taxpayers' money to arms companies for research. They do the research and they make the stuff. And then we use taxpayers' money to buy the stuff that they make. And he said, this has got out of hand. This was 1960, which is 63 years ago. And he said, it's getting out of hand, he said, and I'm very worried about where we're going with this, he said, because it's becoming bigger than ourselves, the government. And his words were prophetic, and I'm not saying that Eisenhower was a nice fella or anything, but it turned out that this monster has grown at an astronomical rate. And today, the Americans, despite the fact that there are 70 million people living in poverty, they now spend 830 billion a year. And that's actually on arms. But that's a conservative figure, and the more realistic figure is 1.5 trillion if you take in all the different dimensions. Now, the fourth point I wanted to talk about, and the worry in Europe, is cash for weapons, right? There's an EU defence fund now, and when Patricia was in the European Union, there wasn't any budget money going towards arms, but there is now, and this is a new thing. And it's actually against the treaty rules, but they have different ways of getting around challenges. But the EU Defence Fund, back in 2015, they wanted to set up a structure to look at about whether the European Union as an entity should be involved directly in funding military capacity in any form and defence capacity. They set up a group, an experts group, in 2015, and it's just so happened that over 80% of the people on the expert panel were working for the arms industry. And lo and behold, they came up with the idea that the European Defence Fund would be set up and that they would give money towards the defence of Europe. And this meant buying stuff from the arms industry in order to protect us from threats from outside. Because we had a lot of reason to be worried that someone was going to invade us. Now, that was eventually set up in 2020, and the amount of money going into it is going to increase with every passing day. Now, it's supposed to be about building peace and security, but we know that buying arms and guns and tanks never actually really brought peace anywhere. We had a debate this week on we're going to actually overturn labour rules and laws in Europe now to produce ammunition 24/7 in order to feed the Ukraine war. We actually debated that this week and we voted on it. Think about it. Imagine if we decided that we were prepared to go to unfathomable lengths to deal with poverty, or to deal with a housing crisis. Imagine if we worked 24/7 to deal with poverty or a housing crisis or the health service. Imagine. Wouldn't that be amazing? But we're going to do that now to make ammunition, to fuel the war in Ukraine, just to make sure it doesn't stop. The last point I wanted to make and talk about was the strategic compass, it's called. Now, the strategic compass is the idea of a single geopolitical military bloc. And this is where Michael Martin comes in. Because it's very strongly linked to NATO, and it's very much linked to the idea of bringing the strays into the camp. Because there's some people in Europe still who are not 100% on board with the NATO project. Now, I haven't time tonight to go into the NATO project, but I'd love to be talking about it, because the media will not be telling you about it, what they're really at. But the idea of bringing the strays into the camp brings my mind back to 2003, when the West illegally went to war in Iraq on the lie that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq held by Hussein, and it was all very well. You had the US and you had the UK who were gung-ho and were all for it. Blair and Bush both thought this was actually a Christian message. They were doing this for God. They were going to kill 1 million innocent civilians in Iraq for God. But it ended up, they put a lot of pressure on a lot of countries. They ended up with at least 45 countries in the coalition of the willing. It's very important for them to get other little innocent countries like Ireland on board. Now, we weren't actually one of the 45, despite the fact that we should have actually been classified in it, given that we had allowed Shannon to be used to kill an awful lot of Muslims. But this same philosophy is at play now with the strategic compass. And the whole notion of you're either with us or against us, Bush said, and Bertie Ahern repeated it in the Dáil in 2003. You're either with us or against us. We've heard the very same slogan for the last number of months about Ukraine. And over the countries that with over 80% of the world's population have refused to take sides in the war. They're not taking Russia's side, they're not taking the US NATO side, EU side. They are looking for peace. They have over 80% of the world's population. But the EU is telling them, you're either with us or against us. I had a big argument last week in the Foreign Affairs Department committee with the Latin American head, the European External Action Service individual, a woman, smart woman, and she was giving out about the fact that Lula wasn't totally on page with the EU project in Ukraine, because Lula has been calling for peace. He's not supporting Russia, and he's certainly not going to support a US NATO proxy war. He's calling for peace. So they said that they need more dialogue with him in order to bring him around. And I said, sorry now, but I said, Lula is not actually going to change his position. I said, are you going to sacrifice your relationship now with Brazil because of you're either with us or against us mantra? I said, he is well. I said, Lula's not going to change his position. I said, the rest of the world are not going to change their position. You're isolating yourselves. You're on the wrong side of history. But that's the space we're in. And look, the biggest problem of all for me is that I see the international order has broken down. The UN is more compromised on the Western side than it ever was before. It's less neutral. The UN were at the talks in March 2015 with Obama and the Saudis in the UAE. They gave the Saudis in the UAE permission to bomb Yemen back to the Stone Age. The UN were part of that. Other institutions are in trouble. The OPCW the Organisation for the Prevention of the Use of Chemical Weapons. You're probably not reading about it in the Irish Times, except when they're giving out about us for highlighting the fact that there's serious question marks over some of the chemical attacks that took place in Syria. You get demonised for daring to actually speak at a time in Syria. We see the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The head of the International Criminal Court initiated an investigation into Israeli war crimes in Palestine and Gaza. And they were looking at Hamas. There was uproar, and the Americans threatened them. She then she said she was going to investigate war crimes by the US and the Taliban in Afghanistan. They sanctioned her, they revoked her visa to America. She's been replaced by a different guy. And he's just started an investigation into war crimes committed by Putin. He has refused to pursue the Israeli allegations, and he has dropped the allegations against America in Afghanistan. The ICC is in trouble. International law is in trouble. And Ireland could be playing a wonderful independent role as a neutral country and looking for peace, opposing wars which are stupid, promote the interests of the ordinary people who don't want war. It's actually costs them money. Other people make a lot of money out of it. Back in 1950, Woody Guthrie, the wonderful American songwriter, said, if we could fix it so that you couldn't make money from war, he says we'd forget what we're even killing folks for.
Thanks very much, Mick. One thing I was thinking of when you mentioned that those who call for us to go join NATO are the same type of people who never actually go abroad and enlist themselves. It's a bit like the kind of keyboard warriors who talk about turning up and disrupting anti-war events and they never show up. So I kind of found that interesting. But next we'll go to Karen Devine, Dr. Karen Devine. Karen lectures in DCU in International Relations. So Karen, finish us off.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Thanks to everyone for coming. So it's hard to follow our two great speakers there. But I suppose I was going to make sort of 3 points in 3 areas, and a lot of it is sort of adding to what was said earlier by Patricia and by Mick. So one of the things that Leo Varadkar, Michael Martin, Simon Coveney have been saying over the last 12 months is so we're not a member of a military alliance, we're not a member of NATO, there's no plans to change that, but we are not neutral in this war in Ukraine, right? Those 2 sub-clauses of that one sentence are completely incompatible with each other by their own definition. So what happened was that in the Treaty in the European Union, the Maastricht Treaty, which was ratified in 1993, that started the security and defence policy. It said it might eventually lead to a common defence. So subsequently, Treaty of Amsterdam, 98, Treaty of Nice, 2002, they were basically decided to merge the European Union with a military alliance called the Western European Union Military Alliance. So the WEU, for short, was created in 1948, the year before NATO in 1949, and it's based on what's called the Brussels Treaty. And in the Brussels Treaty, Article 5 of that treaty says if one or more of the parties are attacked, the others have an obligation of aid and assistance by all means in their power, military or other. That's not what's known as a mutual defence clause. So the EU decided it was going to subsume and merge the WEU with the EU. And it started it in Amsterdam. It said that the merger will happen. It continued the merger through the Nice Treaty. These treaties are primary legislation. You have to have it written in primary legislation to order enact secondary legislation like directives and regulations, which is the business of lawmaking at the EU level. And then with the Lisbon Treaty, so the Lisbon Treaty amended the Treaty on European Union, just like Amsterdam and Nice did. And that was when they finalised the merger. And the one outstanding part of the merger was, I mean, they absorbed the Western European Armaments Group, the WEAG, and they renamed it the European Defence Agency, the EDA. So the Mutual Defence Clause of the Brussels Treaty, Article 5, was the one part that they needed. And Ireland, funnily enough, along with the UK and other neutrals, were saying, we don't want this. So Sweden, Austria, Finland, who had joined in 1994. And by the way, before they joined, if you look at the European Commission review of the applications in 1992, the European Commission said economically these countries are great, but politically there's a problem because they claim to be neutral, and that is incompatible with a future common defence of the EU. So the EU told them to drop neutrality. And the same thing was what happened to Ireland in the 1960s, and the EU actually gave them a phrase to use: just tell them you have military neutrality. And I'll get to that point. So let's go back to the Lisbon Treaty and the merger. So the Irish government, along with the neutrals in the UK, said no, we don't want this to happen when this was proposed by the Germans and the French for the Amsterdam Treaty and the Nice Treaty, but for the Lisbon Treaty it did get through. Brian Cowan wrote a letter on the 5th of December 2003 to the Presidium, which is basically a group of civil servants and politicians who had the job of shepherding these draft treaty provisions into the Lisbon Treaty on security and defence. And he wrote a letter on the 5th of December 2003, and he said, look, we want to change the wording of this mutual defence clause. So we want to say that if a member is attacked, the others, it can request assistance from the other member states. And this was rejected. And at this point then, in the wake of Tony Blair's St. Malo Declaration, with Jacques Chirac saying they agree with the European defence identity being developed, the British had actually done a U-turn and kind of left Ireland, the neutrals, isolated, and said, no, we will go with this. So that mutual defence clause is now part of the Treaty on European Union, which we all ratified, not the first time, obviously, but we were told to get the question, or the answer right to the question, and the second time it was pushed through. Amid a lot of completely false propaganda of what was in it. So we actually are a member of a military alliance, and it's through this merger with the EU and the WEU. So when the government continued to say, and they use this phrase, traditional policy of military neutrality, you need to understand what that means. That means being a member of a military alliance. Okay? We are under an obligation of mutual assistance. It's obligatory. It's written in law. And in fact, that clause was triggered by the French when the Bataclan was attacked by terrorists back in, I think it was December 2015. And we had to send troops. So we sent troops to Mali to replace French troops who went off to engage in military operations after that. So when the government says we're not a part of a military alliance, they're lying. And they've been lying for years, and they know they've been lying. A lot of the Europhiles will say, well, actually celebrated this. There was a book written, Peter Sutherland wrote the foreword, of course, and some what they call Jean Monnet academics, who are basically lecturers who are placed in universities to act as lecturers and seem like academics, but their salaries are directly paid by the EU. And so these are the ones you'll hear in the media. You'll never hear a non-Jean Monnet academic talk about European security and defence, or for that matter, neutrality. So yeah, effectively the propaganda war has been won at the university level, and the fact that this mutual defence clause is actually in the treaties was acknowledged in a book that was published in 2011, which says the EU is now not just an economic union, it is now a military union. And the government needs to go, a new government, because Fine Gael was not in power at that time, a new government needs to go and tell the Irish public how great this is. So they published the fact that they know the EU is a military alliance. And of course, when I wrote about this in the Irish Times, for some reason they asked me to write 3 public service articles on neutrality, and the last one was on the Lisbon Treaty. And I said, look, I'm going to say there's a merger and it's going to create an effective EU military alliance. Those same Jean Monnet academics wrote a series of articles in response saying that basically Irish defence policy not neutrality, Irish defence policy remains untouched. So just to say, what the government are saying is outright lies, and they know it. I suppose the second point then is that when we talk about what Mick Wallace was talking about in terms of the military-industrial complex, after 2016 this really took off. The French in particular were delighted that the British left because the British had been dragging their heels on this. And they said, let's pump money into this. So they decided to allocate from, really you're talking just less than £500 million up until then, £27.5 billion over the multi-financial framework. This is the budgetary framework, should I say, for EU expenditure from 2021 to 2027. But that wasn't enough. And by the way, for the Greens, the amount of money they put into biodiversity and climate change mitigation, 10 billion. So they're outspending environmental funding nearly 3 times. And by the way, the military is the biggest climate change gas emitter on the planet. And that's the reason why those climate change emissions are not factored into any accounting of what our climate emissions are. So not just 27.5 billion wasn't enough, and as Mick said, they get around it in terms of being able to use lethal force. So they've come up with what they call the European Peace Facility. So this is what we call peace washing. You've heard of greenwashing, where companies will say, aren't we great? We've got this environmentally friendly product, but all of the rest of their products are destroying the environment. But just focus on this one product. And it's the same thing here in terms of peace washing. So they've gone to the European Peace Facility. They've just allocated 7.9 billion, just 8 billion to it, and all of that money is going into funding lethal force in Ukraine. Lethal force in Ukraine. And only last week they've agreed the legislation for a 5,000 strong army. And it was ironic because I was looking at a piece. I've been grading like a maniac for the last 6 weeks, and for the course on Irish foreign policy, a student was quoting, and I decided I'd look at the actual debate. And it was Paul Keogh, I think it was in around 2018, and when it was raised in the Dáil that this EU army is basically on the train tracks and is going to end up being created, he kept dismissing the TDs in the Dáil that were raising this, and he said, no, I know Jean-Claude Juncker has called for this repeatedly, but that's just his personal opinion. That's what he said. The head of the Commission, who has control over the legislative agenda, sole right of initiative, and is being driven to the EU army project, that's just his personal opinion. And then finally, let's talk about public opinion. So I did my PhD thesis on why Irish attitudes to Irish neutrality, public opinion on Irish neutrality. And so I have plotted and looked at every single opinion poll that has ever been published on the subject in Ireland. And I've also looked at Eurobarometer. I'll tell you one quick story about Eurobarometer. I wrote a paper on this and I looked at every single poll that was conducted by Eurobarometer that asked about security and defence. So what's Eurobarometer? Eurobarometer is a public opinion survey that happens in every single EU member state. It's a nationally representative sample, and so they do put questions on about security and defence. And I was looking back in 1979. Funnily enough, it was the Americans that funded this particular survey. And they asked people in 9 different member states. So you're talking big states like France, and they didn't have Ireland, Denmark, and the UK, Britain in it at the time. But they asked the core group of 9 member states of the EC at the time, which of these are your preferences? So have your country, be a solid member of NATO, have your country be part of a sort of a Western European Union type military alliance, which obviously was in existence, or would you like your country to be neutral, or none of the above? A plurality, a majority, the biggest proportion of responses in France, for example, was in favour of neutrality. Okay, neutrality was the second most popular across the board, across the EU, or the EC at the time. Do you know what they decided to do? They dropped that option from the answer set. So I was never able to track popular opinion on neutrality. But let's fast forward to today, and this is the last point I make because I know we're running out of time here. There was recently a poll published, I think Sunday Business Post covered it, 23rd of March this year, and the headline was that a majority, for the first time ever, very exciting news, announced internationally, for the first time ever, a majority of Irish people want to join NATO. And I thought, rubbish. Let's have a look at this. Because I know they manipulate opinion polling. And I know they misreport opinion polling. Again, I've written about this. So of course I asked for the questionnaire from Red Sea, who did the poll, and they refused to provide it for me. So I sort of dug around, and there was a report that was published, and I don't remember, it's a new research agency that published it. It seems to be a one-woman show with a guy who spent 4 months doing an internship there. They're the authors of this. I did a dig on her on LinkedIn, actually, and for the previous 10 years she was flogging orange juice. She was head of consumer insight for Britvic. But anyway, she published this report. And this was a report that declared that for the first time a majority was in favour of joining NATO. So I looked at their sample. So their sample was 1,800 people. I thought robust enough. Let me see what the question wording was. So it turned out they divide this 1,800 into separate samples, 3 separate samples of 600. And they decided to do an experiment. And so what they did was they asked the first 600 people, they told them a scenario. They basically said, Ireland is in World War III. No, it gets better. Ireland is entirely defenceless, as according to the latest the latest Irish Defence Commission report. And finally, Ireland is entirely vulnerable because we're not a member of NATO. It makes us a target. Do you want to join NATO? Okay. That's what they did, and then they combined it with the control, which they didn't manipulate. They had a third manipulation in relation to some kind of environmental thing, and then they said, according to this opinion poll, and they didn't admit the manipulations they did. So this is the extent that they're going to try to continue to persuade Irish people to join NATO and to give up neutrality. And yeah, the consultative forum, I mean, I've only been publishing on neutrality for the last sort of 20 years. I'm the only academic in the world that has the highest peer-reviewed publications in the world, and somehow I don't think the invitation is in the post. That's what I have to say.
Thanks very much, Karen. A lot of brilliant insight there. So we only have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So I'll say we can do 2 questions, keep them very short, and also keep them very good questions, quality not quantity. So somebody want to ask a question first? Yes, you?
Yeah, so we've got a military-industrial complex in America of $83 billion that you're saying. So
No,
Europe,
830.
Parliament, 830 billion.
Well, what I said was that the Americans are presently spending 830 billion on producing arms, but that only covers a certain section of their military spend. Their total military spend surpasses 1.5 trillion per annum.
Okay, so can we do the same for Ireland? And can we do the same for Europe? And find out what the budget is and what the percentage of that budget is compared to what they're spending on everything else. And then can you tell me, when you get rid of all the armies, what are you going to do with them? How are you going to repopulate them, or what are you going to do, put them in? And how are you going to finance it? And then are you going to tell me we'll have peace and everything's rosy and we're all happy? So now, how are we going to approach this so that we're all happy, that we're defended, and we're sustainable, and we have a budget that's not going where we don't want it to go?
So I don't really understand your question. I mean, are you asking me?
Well, first of all, do you know the Irish military budget?
But yes, well, it's just over just over 1 billion a year at the moment.
Of our 60 billion that we spend.
No, Ireland spends just over 1 billion per year on defence, and
the budget
it's 1/3% of our GDP. But obviously, there's pressure on them to increase that to 2%, which would mean that we will be spending roughly around 6 billion per year.
Okay, and how many military personnel do we have?
We're just over 10,000 at the moment.
Okay, so, and Europe? What's the situation in Central Europe?
in the spend,
Yeah.
it varies by member state. There's
Is it 1.5% of the budget, or is
Well, it depends. I mean, Ukraine is in Europe, and Ukraine were spending over 4.5%, I think, before the war even started. But then obviously there was huge investment there as well. I had Stoltenberg before me, and I had went to question him at the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he actually boasted that NATO were in Ukraine since 2014. So there's a whole lot of money been spent on military in Ukraine. That's not, the Ukrainians are not spending, even though they're spending about 4.5% of their GDP already, which is off the Richter scale in comparison to a country like France, for example. France would be close to the 2% mark. Germany has never really gone above 1.5, even though the Greens will probably drag them a little bit higher soon. But I mean, there's sorry.
No, I just want to come in.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
This man will just has a question.
Just possibly just as a small aside to that thing about financing military stuff, I understand that the British were still repaying the Americans in about 1980 for money advanced during the Second World War. So Mr. Zelensky will have probably to look at these historical examples. However, a more pertinent point, I've always felt that the reason why they've had great difficulty in shifting Irish people's attachment to neutrality is because nobody in this country sees the state as something that fights wars. The state as the state has never been involved in the war. Unlike, for example, in Britain or America or France, where the state is seen and is felt by people to be something that does wars. I just wondering what your comment might be on that.
But I could just link that into the other question that came in there, because I think to a certain extent you were saying about what happens when we get rid of all the armies, you know, and you're talking about what's our perception here. Like, not everybody is saying just because we want neutrality we want to get rid of armies. Like, one of the arguments that did come, you know, in previous years was about how our own army, because was actually very constructive in relation to peacekeeping missions because we were seen as neutral. And there is this thing, like, there's a difference between peacekeeping and peace enforcement. Peace enforcement is basically enforcing peace through war, but peacekeeping is where you're trying to keep the peace. And our soldiers, when Ireland was seen as traditionally neutral and wasn't aligned and hooked onto any other country, was very positive. And I do think that if you're talking about the debate on neutrality generally in this country, there are a lot of people who have a certain, respect for our armed forces in relation to traditionally what they would have done in that. And you also have to be careful in relation to that, to say if we're getting rid of armies, I don't think that will actually go down well. And there is also the idea that, you do need to a certain extent have some sort of army, but it can be used very positively, not negatively, which is what is going to be happening now with what's going on. So,
yeah, I mean, Ireland has always used its military for peacekeeping, and it's very valued because we are recognised as post-colonial, and we are recognised. We were recognised as being independent. Like, this is a booklet that's published by AFRI called A Force for Good. And I have a little piece in that where I analysed Frank Aiken and what he was proposing in terms of peace plans for Central Europe. And if the Irish government wanted to help contribute to resolving the war in Ukraine, all they have to do is follow all of what Frank Aiken was saying in terms of disarmament, peacekeeping, in terms of creating an area of law, which essentially would be a demilitarized zone, etc. I mean, the more you spend on the military, the more likely you are to get war. And one of the things I would say about all of this money that's pouring in is that, and you can Google this, Google the CDU spending affair. What's the CDU? It's the major German political party that has been in government for several decades. Helmut Kohl was in charge back in the day when it was found out that his second in command was Wolfgang Schäuble. Wolfgang Schäuble was taking bribes from US arms dealers. One of them was called Karl-Heinz Schreiber. And the third in command of the party at the time was Angela Merkel. So Helmut Kohl resigned over it, and eventually Wolfgang Schäuble resigned over it. Now Angela Merkel brought him back in time to bounce us into our bailout. But you know, the level of corruption involved in arms deals is off the scale, and there's plenty of academic work to show that. And you only have to look at Chirac, even President Mitterrand's son was involved in, and look at the Karachi affair, Google that. Look at not just the CDU spending affair, like the German government officials and ministers and government leaders were up to their hock in corruption in relation to arms deals. And when you look at, even look at not just the Karachi affair, but the Libyan arms deals as well. So you've got Nicolas Sarkozy was up on charges, brought up on charges for arms corruption. So I think that was probably one of the main reasons why the French and the Germans were so keen to get the funding for arms up to the EU level, because there they can't be touched. And the European Parliament has no co-decision with the Council, and that peace facility they talked about, the 8 billion that they're funneling into Ukraine, they call it off books, so that there's no actual oversight even at the EU level for it. It's just member states putting it into a fund. So you've got to understand the level of corruption. War is a business. And it's the business of killing, and that's what this is about. It's certainly not about peace. And by the way, if you look at any of the primary legislation in the treaties, the secondary legislation in relation to this new 5,000 troop force at the EU level, in relation to the peace facility, in relation to PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation and Defence, in which they want troops to operate as a single set of forces, that's in the treaty, in other words an army, but we can't call it an army. If you look at all of that, not one word said peacekeeping. It's all enforcement. It's all lethal force. So the government is trying to tell us, yes, we need to join this new EU army, we need to get involved in CSDP, so it'll make us interoperable and make us better UN peacekeepers. It has nothing whatsoever to do with UN peacekeeping.
Just on the point about keeping soldiers and armies in work, in 2007, the Americans decided to start taking their own troops out of the place, and it was the end of Bush's term. Obama came in and he continued. So between 2007 and 2010, there was almost only some advisory staff left of their own army, and they privatized the whole thing. And the Americans claimed at the end that they spent 2.16 trillion in Afghanistan, but over 2 trillion went to the private sector. They literally privatized the war in order to enrich people that used to helped them to get elected. And they're putting their own army actually out of business, they are, by privatization.
Business, big business always works.
Alright, yeah, very last question then.
Yeah, I just want to talk about children and the effects of this war. Like the NATO airstrikes, children have been killed, and I think we can send out a message by saying we don't want to join NATO, we don't want to be complicit in the killings of children, and children have died, children are refugees, and I think we need to make that point very, very clear.
Yeah, I'd like to say something on that very quickly. So I was looking, it was the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, as well as the invasion of Afghanistan, totally illegal, led by the US coalition of the willing. There was a report published in The Lancet, which is a medical journal, where they did research on the number of civilians that were killed by the military, NATO-led military. Now, by the way, they didn't ask in that survey that I just talked about, where they announced that all the Irish people wanted to join, well, the majority wanted to join NATO. They didn't have another vignette which talked about what I'm going to tell you now, in that they estimated that the NATO sort of backed coalition of the willing, those forces killed 680,000 civilians, a record number of between 9,000 and 14,000 per month. right, in the wake of the start of the war, and it was policy to do so. There are a number of whistleblowers from the military who have explained what it is, and it was confirmed. And only but for the fact that there was one reporter that was killed when he was amongst the civilians, and he was reporting for Reuters. So Reuters demanded an investigation into the killing, and they didn't get one. And they tried to take a legal case to get to the bottom of it. And in the end, I think the US military themselves held an inquest, and nothing came of it. But you're talking about nearly three quarters of a million innocent civilians that were killed, and that was policy. So that's what war does. Like, it destroys families, it destroys communities, it destroys schools, hospitals, it destroys agricultural land, it destroys animals, it pollutes the lakes, the rivers, it destroys everything. And that, yeah, so.
I just mentioned one thing that, because it came to me just there while we were watching the beginning of the NATO-led war against Russia and Ukraine, and it was the coverage in the media, because we saw all this horrible stuff that was happening to Ukrainians, and the way the media were reporting on it, because it was like, to me, it was like deja vu, because it just brought me back to what was happening in Iraq, in the first Iraq war. Because that was the first time we ever saw this televised kind of computerized version of war. And I remember at the time it was just horrendous to watch this carpet bombing of these countries. And there was a documentary done a few years after, just in relation to Iraq. There was a documentary done a few years afterwards called How to Tell Lies and Win Wars, a Channel 4 documentary. It was an Irish journalist who did it. It's really worth Googling to find out what they did. They employed Sashi to basically do the PR for the war before they went in the first place, and all of the things they did were horrendous. So it's really, I can't remember the name of the journalist, but it's really worth Googling it and looking it up. It is on YouTube. It's a Channel 4 documentary called How to Tell Lies and Win Wars, and I can't remember the journalist, the woman journalist.
And there's one quick point about the strategic compass, Mick, that you made, but they actually have a fund to combat misinformation. So they're going to put millions into suppressing you. That's going to be down the line.
Well, sorry, on that issue, Inga, they actually set up a new committee 3 years ago to deal with misinformation and propaganda. And listen, we say it on a daily basis. Do the Russians and Chinese engage in misinformation and propaganda? Yeah, they do, yeah. And so does everyone else, right? And you know what? The Chinese and the Russians, they're not even good at it. I mean, we don't believe most of the shite they throw at us on the right. Whereas, you know what? We're swallowing the US and the European line much better. And we actually think it's the truth, a lot of it. So who's good at it?
Based on what we've heard this evening from the speakers, is a campaign for a referendum to include neutrality in the Irish Constitution lost? Is it dead in the water?
Oh, well, if it happens, they are going to deluge and pressure to make sure that they win it. They're not going to run it unless they can win it, and they want the answer to be, no, we don't want neutrality in the Constitution. Otherwise, they won't run it.
There was somebody proposing that I think some of the parties, there would be a private members bill to get a wording that they would try and put this forward. That's a few years back in relation to positive neutrality in the Constitution. It never happened.
I have an article in Irish Political Studies that I can make available, and so I plotted it over 4 decades what the oppositions of each Irish political party was. On one dimension was neutrality, so military neutrality, which is completely fake, it's being part of a military alliance, or active positive neutrality, and the other one was maximalist European security and defence and minimalist European security and defence. And one of the things I plotted was when parties said put neutrality in the Constitution, so the very first party that did that, and it was in the 70s, was the Labour Party, right? The next, or I think it was in the 80s, the next party that did that was the Green Party, okay? And each time they shifted away from it, and then the final party that was supposed to be for it is Sinn Féin.
Yeah.
And every single party has gone from that way over to we're in favour of Ireland's traditional policy of military neutrality, i.e. being a part of a military alliance going full pelt into the European security and defence structures and supporting the EU army that is coming down the line.
Yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there. So, but definitely a really engaging kind of discussion. Shame we didn't have more time and everything, but I think unfortunately this discussion is still going to be going on. If no doubt next year we'll be discussing it in different forms again and again and again. Well, I would end with there's a good rhetorical quote from Fidel Castro when he was talking about NATO and the US, and he put it rhetorically that who has NATO ever actually saved? So that's something to think about. There's not many. But thanks very much.